Without further ado, it's my privilege to be presenting a lecture today entitled From Labors to Levels, Hercules' Journey Through Retro Video Games. As I hope is fairly self-evident from the title, my focus is Hercules' portrayal as a character in the early history of video games. It's something of a little bit of a passion project of mine, and I think reflecting on it, part of the reason why is because this is such an interdisciplinary topic. It's part reception studies, the intersection of antiquity and modern media. It's part historical analysis, have to do a little bit of digging into the past to uncover early video game history, as well as things like narratology and ludology, game studies, those sorts of things. And so the shape of this lecture today is going to sort of fall into three broad parts. I want to start by going over some of the key concepts that sort of underpin my approach to things like character and storytelling and the likes, particularly for video games, since there is such a plurality of methodologies with no real key consensus amongst scholarship as to what or how is the best approach. Ask 5 scholars and you'll get 6 different methodologies. I'm going to gloss over, thankfully, most of the nuances of that debate, but I do want to highlight 3 key elements that are going to underline everything that I sort of talk about today. Then the sort of meat of what I want to talk about today is what I'm calling Hercules' back catalogue, and that's really his appearance in early video games. We're going to look at some obscure entries, some subtle references, and hopefully some prominent titles that you may have heard of. But I suspect the majority of these, particularly the earliest ones, will be entirely new to the majority of us. And then with that sort of foundational key concepts in place, while we're going through that back catalogue, I want to reflect on how character is created in these games, how it's defined, how it's recognized, and the things that sort of shape and influence those portrayals. And spoiler alert, there are 2 key conclusions that I want us to draw out today. The first of these is that the themes of Hercules' character are largely consistent across video game genres and video game periods, even if we moved beyond the retro gaming period. He's the mythical son of Zeus, he's a strong warrior, he's a hero, and he's most famous for completing his 12 labors. The second conclusion, which is simultaneous to this, and it's not mutually exclusive, even though it might appear at the outset to be a little bit contradictory, is that the way that Hercules' persona is expressed takes on various forms or interpretations, and these are shaped in response to the constraints and the demands of genre and gameplay conventions, which are in turn shaped by technological limitations or developments, which, in my opinion, is what makes this early period of gaming history so interesting and exciting, because technology is sort of constantly shifting and it's evolving at sort of an exponential rate. So, what are the key concepts? I promised 3 of them. Well, one of the key differences when it comes to studying video games is that unlike the majority of media, like television, film, comics, books, and the like, which require, we might frame it as passive consumption, video games are innately interactive. And this interactivity has a sort of cascading effect for how we study them. The key concept here, if we want to be formal, is ergodic media. And then if we want to be nerdy, we can sort of etymologically relate that to 2 classical Greek words, ergon and hodos, meaning work and path, which I think ends us up on quite a nice definition of what we mean by ergodic media. This is things where the reader, the consumer, the player works to create path through the text. Simply put, direct participation is required in order to shape and create meaning. So the consequences of this really can't be overstated. Only video games immersive in a way is not easily replicated by other media, but they can be highly variable in their experience. And as we'll see, sometimes this experience can be created consciously by the player. Sometimes it's created unconsciously. And sometimes it's imposed upon the player by the game itself. What this means for us when we come to think about video games is sometimes we'll be talking about things like gameplay mechanics, the rules behind the game. Sometimes we'll be talking about contemporary critics' reviews, sometimes interviews or commentaries with developers or publishers. And then on top of all of that, we'll also be talking about, in this instance, my experience as a gamer interacting with these games. The other thing I want to just sort of briefly highlight, and it's more sort of a delineation of where we're focusing our attention today, is what era of history of video games are we talking about? My title referenced retro gaming, which is a phenomena that describes playing and collecting old video games and consoles. Sometimes it's also called classic gaming, or sometimes old school gaming. Now, retro gaming is connected innately with nostalgia. And so formal definitions of what period it covers are hard to come by because it's so innately subjective, especially in relation to who the retro gamers are. So for our purposes today, I'm limiting retro gaming to what scholars such as Wolf have identified as the first two generations of video games. Now, these generations as a concept are distinct from video game console generations. And so the periods we're talking about, the first generation starts at 1971 and goes through to about 1984. And this is kind of really its own little world of video game phenomena that does lots of weird things. And we begin with the commercial release of the first microprocessor, which has sort of spurred the whole industry, through to what's colloquially known as the Great Video Game Crash of North America, about 1983, 1984. And that point is where consumer confidence in the gaming industry really dropped. Lots of the blame is placed on ET, the video game, but it's in reality a bit more complex than that. But then the second generation, we get sort of this rebirth of the industry, beginning with Nintendo releasing the NES in North America, which was sort of a revamping of their popular Famicom console. And we have about a decade through to 1995, where we get the release of the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64, where gaming gets sort of increasingly sophisticated at this point, particularly in terms of 3D graphics, but also things like CD-ROMs, online play, which make games very sort of expensive. So that's the period of time we're sort of going to be broadly talking about today. I should also note we're going to limit ourselves to the Western market. There are a lot of great Japanese games going on in this time, particularly because they didn't suffer as much from the great video game crash phenomena. But that would be a whole nother kettle of fish. So we're going to just ignore that for now and focus on Western. And then the third sort of concept that I want to just highlight is what unites all our video games that we're going to talk about today, or rather, what unites our perspective on Hercules as a character. And that's the notion of transmedia. And I'm borrowing this from Blom, who's written a recent monograph on transmedia storytelling and characters in video games. And I really like the way that they describe it. They talk about figures that look like the same character while not being the same person. And if that seems overly complicated to you, I want to reassure you that this is something that you will be engaging with, a concept you'll be engaging with, even if you don't realize it. And I'm going to use Hercules as an example of how we engage with transmedia characters without even realizing it. So perhaps you are aware of the Hercules of antiquity, and some vases and a mosaic there. Or perhaps Hercules, you're more familiar with the Hercules of the Renaissance masters. Perhaps you are into Hercules and Peplum or mid-90s children's cartoons. Or maybe you're more of a comics person and you know Hercules, whether Marvel or DC. Maybe, unless you've been living under a rock, you might not be aware of Disney's Hercules. Or being from New Zealand, as I am, we're particularly partial to Hercules, the Legendary Journeys, and Xena Warrior Princess from the mid-90s. Or real tours, and that's perhaps Callan Lutz or Dwayne The Rock Johnson in Hercules' movies from 2014. Now, you'll be able to look at all these Hercules and immediately recognize that these are all the same character, but they're not all the same person. That's what we mean when we talk about transmedia. There are things that unite all of these persons so they're recognizable as being a character, but they're also unique. That's what we're talking about today. We're limiting ourselves to a single media, to video games, but it's going to underpin our approach because of all the shifting genres within video. So those were our three key concepts. And so we're going to jump straight into Hercules, that canon, beginning the first generation. Like I said, this is a really exciting period because we get lots of firsts for Hercules as a video game character. But it's also a period of quite a lot of complexity. So we are going to spend a bit more time on the first generation than the second generation. But you'll see why it makes sense to do that in hindsight. So while the first generation begins in 1971, we don't actually get the first reference to Hercules in video games until 1979. So he's quite a late entry into video games. And the first references to Hercules are in two basic text adventures. Now, I'm not using basic here as a slur. That's an early programming language. So it's a specific type video game. Now, these two basic text adventures are Journey to Atlantis by Greg Hassett and Atlantean Odyssey by Terry Kepner. They're both typical examples of the text adventure genre. The game world's described by written text. Player interacts with the game world with simple textual instructions, things like go north, take lamp, things like that. And in terms of the content, the narrative, they're also both fairly typical. You, as the player, explore a labyrinthine dungeon to recover treasure, and in both of these cases, the dungeons or the labyrinths are in the titular Atlantis. Now, having said all that, I do have a minor confession. Technically, these games don't include Hercules as a character, in that he's not a player character and he's not an NPC. But they do contain the first references to his name and his mythology, which is why I've sort of put at the very start here. Both games include Hercules in that there are specific rooms identified as the pillars or the gates of Hercules. These landmarks are associated with his labor to steal Durian's cattle, while they're also sort of thematically associated with Atlantis. Plato uses them to demonstrate the island's localization sort of beyond the reaches of the known world. So that's sort of Hercules' first blink and you'll miss it reference or allusion in video games. But if we want to think about the first contenders for the earliest character for Hercules in gameplay, we really begin with Akiton. Now, this is quite a culturally significant text adventure. And if you were to aware of it, then as a retro gamer, shame on you. uh, it was one of the 15 titles written for the University of Cambridge's Phoenix IBM mainframe, which makes it one of the first text adventures written outside of America, but also one of the largest text adventures of its time. It had just over 160 objects you could interact with in just over 400 locations. So huge, hence why it's on a university mainframe rather than a tiny little personal computer. Now, in this text adventure, players must visit the underworld, which is inhabited by various historical mythical individuals stuck in repetitive and futile acts. And one of these figures is Hercules. He's described as being locked in mortal combat with the hydra, trying to light a fire, unable to because the ground is covered with slime. So we have here Hercules appearing, interestingly, immediately associated with one of his 12 labors, the hydra being perhaps the most well-known of his labors. But even beyond this, when we're thinking about character in video games, what makes this appearance interesting is that the exact individuals, these characters counted by the player in the underworld, are allocated by the game's use of procedural randomization. Practice means some players will encounter Hercules, while others traverse through the underworld, none the wiser as to his presence, should the pre-programmed algorithm fail to land on the necessary variables. What does that mean when we come to think about Hercules as a character? We essentially end up with an age-old philosophical thought experiment. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? And so when we're thinking about video game character, we're really having to think about the relationship between intent and potential to appear, not just actual appearances, which can require quite a lot of nuance when we come to study games. Moving beyond Akiton, though, 1981 was actually quite a good year for Hercules video games. And it's here that we find a related illustration about the complexities of characterization in another early text adventure, this one being Ulysses and the Golden Fleece. As the title suggests, the player takes on the role of Ulysses, of Odysseus, and has to recover the Golden Fleece. Now, during this quest, the player has to visit a tavern to recruit crew, cargo, at which point you might encounter Hercules. You might notice in the text that accompanies this graphic that the game states, I think one of them is Hercules. We have the game itself undermining Hercules' identification. Further complicating this person, whoever they are, Hercules is never mentioned again throughout the entirety of the game's quest. The player does interact with the crew, for example, having to plug their ears with wax to avoid the siren's call, but it only allows you to engage with them as a sort of homogenous collective rather than a group of individuals. So even if Hercules is in your crew, we don't get any further reference to. Thinking about character, it's not the sense of the crew being a shared identity that's problematic. We have lots of examples of collective characters in video games, and we have no issue with this. Think of the Pikmin or the Lemmings. Furthermore, it's not that Hercules' lack of any agency or ludic interaction with the player is problematic. Think Princess Peach in early Mario games. What is the problem here is that Hercules seems to lack sort of any real function or role in the game and its wider narrative. We could remove that entire reference to him and we would be none the worse for it. He's sort of a null state, a null character. we might well say, well, if the game doesn't even seem concerned with figuring out if he's present or not, should we? And so it's a bit of an odd appearance for a hero, the greatest of the Greek heroes, and we're not really that concerned if he's in our game or not. Taking that framework a little bit further, pushing it a little bit further, we come to Ultima. We have here a slight shift in genre as well, this being an early computer role-playing game. Now, Ultima provides a nice counterpoint when we're thinking about what's the point of a character being in a game? Do they have to have a specific function? Because in Ultima, Hercules lacks any notion of ludic agency. He lacks specific participation in the game's plot, just like in Ulysses and the Golden Fleece. But I feel he's definitely much more of a character in this game. So, where does Hercules appear? Well, he doesn't. And again, I'm trying not to be contradictory here. You'll see what I mean. Hercules is present in that his name is given to a dungeon found in the anachronistic land of the feudal lords. This dungeon is titled Where Hercules Died. You're going, hold on, Hercules isn't even a person in this game? How can he be a character? Well, what makes this Hercules distinct is to do with intentionality. Richard Garriott, the creator of the game, also known as Lord British, has been very clear that his intent behind Ultimate was to create a game world, a feeling to the game, rather than just a specific sort of fixed narrative you follow. If we want to frame that feeling in a sort of formal conceptual way, we might think about paratextual use of character. And so Hercules here is an example of a paratextual character. He helps tell the story without being in the story in a way that we don't see in Ulysses and the Golden Fleece. You might think of a comparative example here being the scientists in Half-Life who sell the setting at the Black Mesa research facility, whose panic and calm, depending on their state, help indicate how bad things are going as you progress through the game. In the game world of Ultima, Caesarea is the name of the world, we have heaps of references to classical antiquity. The land of the feudal lords is full of references to landmarks such as the Pillar of the Argonauts, other dungeons being named after Harpies and pillars, as well as sort of an extensive integration of Latin language, both in naming conventions and in the game's unique magic system. Hercules' dungeon is to be seen in this wider context. It contributes to Caesarea's feel, just in the way that Hercules is a hero of old, just like the Argonauts. He fits in well with the sort of dichotomy of evil, despotic wizards and a strong protector or savior figure who needs to come and rescue the land. The fact that Hercules is dead contributes to the feel of the game. It helps with the chronology that's setting. The game is geared towards more of a medieval rather than an antiquity focus. And the fact that he's dead raises the stakes. If even the mighty Hercules couldn't save the land, couldn't rescue the dungeon, how much greater is the player's sense of victory in the end? And so while never actually appearing, Hercules' character, in a broad sense, his paratextual character, is an innate part of this game. And so that's a unique part of his character that we don't see, for example, Ulysses in the Golden Fleece, even though he is specifically name-dropped in the game. Then our final 1981 game, Labyrinth of Crete, is another text adventure where you have to obtain the Golden Fleece. It's a bit of a theme in early video games. Now, One of the key features of this game is that you were given dual control of two avatars, and that was a technological novelty, sort of the first instance of that occurring. You control Jason, but you also control Hercules. And so this is the first game in which players could, so to speak, step into the hero's shoes. Now, as a player-controlled character, Hercules has two traits that define his interaction with the game world. He is dynamic and he is interactive. And so he fits into the text adventure framework of ludic problem solving and exploration. And in doing so, we find him as a strength. Hercules is as an avatar, he can solve certain problems that Jason can't. The key being that these are always problems connected to one of two things, either physical strength or his labors. And in fact, the official game guide or hint sheet for this game, one of the clues is literally just Hercules is strong. And from that, the player is supposed to realize that they need to wrestle with Cerberus to allow Jason to sneak past. But we also get, once again, the Hydra appearing. So we have Cerberus and the Hydra, that's two of his labors. We also have Atlas and the Hesperides. And so we get even more sort of expansion. So we have Hercules as a figure of strength and Hercules' connection with his 12 labors. Then, while Hercules sort of played a crucial role as a player avatar in Labyrinth of Crete, we might think of the 1983 game Return of Hercules as being a game in which Hercules truly takes center stage, this being his titular appearance. Now, Stuart Smith was well known for well-researched games, and the game was marketed, and I'm quoting here, as an exploration of Greek mythology translated into modern electronics. And this was the case. There were quite a few little sneaky things that required the player to engage with their working knowledge of Greek myth, or else suffer terrible consequences. And what I like about the Return of Heracles is that it demonstrates all of the themes we've mentioned so far. First of all, we get an association with Hercules and his 12 labors. The player is positioned as one of 19 selectable heroes, or more. You can play as more than one character at the same time. And you have to complete 12 tasks for Zeus. Now, not only is the premise itself reminiscent of Hercules' labors, but 6 of the 12 are included in those labors. Then, if you so wish, you can use the game, what we would call an open world design, to engage with slaying NPC versions of the remaining 6 labors, with a few exceptions. Hippolyta's girdle it's not possible to complete that particular label because you can play as Hippolyta, and so therefore how are you supposed to do that? So constraints of gameplay remove that. So almost all 12 present. But what is a bit intriguing about this game is, despite the implications of the title, Hercules isn't present as one of the selectable heroes. It's only if the player knows that Hercules is a hidden character, performs the process, that you can unlock him as playable. And so here we have another illustration of that ergodic nature. You could complete the game as a player without encountering Hercules through ignorance or through choice, or simply if you were unlucky enough to complete the necessary process. Say you died on the way to completing it. However, should Hercules be blocked, we can see another example of how game mechanics can demonstrate characterization. As typical of CRPGs, the game's various characters, both avatars and NPCs and monsters, have allocations of stat points that define their abilities. For example, if we want to think about swift-footed Achilles, he has two special abilities in the game. He's accompanied by Patroclus, but he also receives sort of this defense bonus that's equivalent to wearing fine armor without having to actually wear any armor. And then he also has the highest speed stat of any person. It's equivalent of often sort of fast-winged monsters like the Pegasus. Hercules, however, is an interesting figure in that part of the unlocking process is you have to begin as Helemon, the weakest of the 19 heroes. Then, once you complete the process, he transforms into Hercules and he becomes the most strong of the heroes. He has a stat rating of 22 and he is the most healthy with a vigor rating of 22. Sort of try within the constraints of the game to reflect him as that sort of overbearing, strong, heroic figure who cannot be defeated. But then finishing off our first generation, we have Hercules' first occurrence outside of the adventure genre with a titular platformer by Steve Buck. As a platformer, this is not an innovative game. It basically riffs on the formula of Donkey Kong. However, it's significant for two reasons. It's the first game which has all 12 of Hercules' labors included. There's 12 labors, so one level for each labor. But the other thing that makes this game interesting is it's often incorrectly identified as Hercules' first video game appearance. But that's due to its extensive afterlife rather than it actually being his first appearance. Now, unlike many of the earlier video games that we've talked about in this genre, Hercules' strength doesn't feature in the platformer. And that's simply because strength is an irrelevant concept. It doesn't have anything to do with falling or climbing. And so we see Hercules' character take on a new sort of trait. And this has to do with the theme of Herculean difficulty, overcoming impossible tasks. And that's simply because the game was super difficult. You could die in numerous ways. Even just standing still would often kill you. And so it came synonymous with this concept of Herculean difficulty. And that brings us through the first generation of video games. We're not going to spend as much time on the second generation. In fact, we're going to do a little bit of jumping around here. The first thing worth mentioning is it's in the second generation we get Hercules' first graphical treatment. And this is in Power Play, a game that came in 1985. It's sort of a board game that's sort of checkers combined with Trivial Pursuit. In the first original 8-bit version for the BBC Micro, very limited in its graphical capabilities, but enough to give us all distinct meeples. And you can see Hercules there, a lovely bearded leotard wearing typical strongman. Same thing of strength. Later ports of the game, such as for the Atari and Amiga consoles, which had 32-bit capabilities, could expand on this. Most notably, now we have a bare-chested Hercules who's wielding his club and looking overly angry, we might add. But I just want to draw our attention to the fact that this kind of Hercules is reminiscent, drawing upon his portrayal in contemporary media from the time, whether this be comic books or peplum. This is the kind of Hercules that we would expect to see in other media. It's sort of what contributes to his transmedial persona. And thinking about other firsts, Hercules' first fighting game is in 1988 with Slayer of the Damned. Now, as a fighting game, Slayer of the Damned is not overly interested in matters of narrative. It presents itself as being loosely aligned with the 12 labors, but in reality, it kind of is a sort of a peripheral to the action, which involves fighting skeletons and fighting giant spiders who reset the player progress. And you'll see around the outside of the game there, you have 12 icons. These are the labors that you have to collect. And some of them are a little bit less straightforward as to what they have to do with the labor, like Cerberus being represented. Right. However, um, what we do see with Hercules is that his character, aside from the association with his labors, is expressed via his moves. He has a whole bunch of dramatic special attacks that he can perform with his club. And these are sort of befitting the warrior status and being chosen of the gods. So he sort of has a different move from various gods. So Pluto gives him one, Hades, Titans, Zeus, and the like. And in fact, the association with the skeletons is itself part of a sort of transmedia contextualization of a sort of fighting game, but also from the likes of Ray Harryhausen, Jason and the Argonauts, Sinbad. Sort of this is all sort of feeding into, of course, Hercules fought against skeletons, even though there's nothing in the mythology that we have that says he fought against skeletons. You kind of don't question it because it's part of a larger context of both action fighting games and sort of this classical world at the movies, so to speak. As I said, we had the sequels and other rebrandings of the Hercules platformer. These aren't really worth looking at because they're simply the same game and commercialized to try and make more money. We could talk about some later text adventures. These are really coming in well then worth talking about because they do mention Hercules. There's sort of exclusive focus on him. They're kind of way past their prime at this point. And so they really belong in that first generation, but don't come out until this sort of second generation. And so they're actually overly conservative in their portrayal of Hercules, particularly the episodes of his madness, his labors. In 1989, we get a game, Gods and Olympus, which is a turn-based strategy game that, in many regards, again, belongs to that earlier generation. It is effectively just an expanded version of what we see with Smith's Return of Hercules. Heracles is present as one of many heroes. He's got stats that are a figure of strength compared to others, can go around perform his labors, other people's labors, and the like. If you want something a little bit different, we have Hercules appearing in an edutainment game. Is edutainment a game or not? That's something we might have to think about if we were to do a detailed dive. But what makes this talking close technique game particularly interesting is that it engages with Hercules' narrative, but gives a moral. In fact, it does this for all the myths it tells. And so Hercules, to quote, teaches students that one must do penance to atone for one's sins and earn forgiveness. We could think about where that comes from, has to do a little bit with children's literature, has to do with a little bit of the sort of Christianizing of myth and the likes, but that's an interesting influence. Also interesting, we have Cheetahman, the franchise that had huge multimedia plans but never eventuated. It's essentially a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles ripoff, but with cheetahs. We have Hercules here marketed as somewhere between a comic oaf and a Rambo-esque action hero. But yeah, the franchise never really eventuated beyond the first game. We could look at Hercules in adventure games, in The Son of Zeus, again, a game that was only released in demo, or in Ancient Glory. And just think about how the action adventure genre required a particular portrayal of not only ancient Greece, but Hercules himself. And you can see the similarities. These are two different games here, but look at the similarities across. We could also talk about Populous 2, which is an interesting strategy game, where we get Hercules in the typical role of a strategy hero unit the first time that happens. But rather than do a deep dive into each of those individual games, we're going to jump straight to a conclusion by looking at one game in particular from this period. And this is Gods from 1991. This is a cinematic platformer. So a very different experience to the like of Steve Back's platformer. This is more like, think, Prince of Persia. In fact, that coined the cinematic platformer genre. What I want us to think about this game in our conclusion and for our purposes today is how Hercules doesn't appear in Gods. You might be going, that's really weird. Why are you going to finish by talking about a game that Hercules doesn't appear in? Well, he doesn't appear in the gameplay, and he doesn't appear in the game's manual. In fact, the manual goes to great lengths to distance itself from identifying our hero. Our hero, this nameless, helmeted warrior. And in fact, this sort of generic approach is typical of the gameplay throughout Gods. Our monsters are generic chaotic beasts. They're called killer, flyer, thief, and guardian. And the thief steals things. The flyer flies. Very generic. Our levels are also generic. We have a city, a labyrinth, a temple, the underworld. So what does this all have to do with Hercules? Well, players, critics were very quick to identify this nameless hero as Hercules and to associate the broadest game with the narrative of his labors. I've given just 2 screenshots of some contemporary magazines, but there are more that I could have just plastered the screen with. And in fact, such was the strength of this connection that it's retained even in contemporary discussions of the game. Game FAQs, Moby Games makes reference to Hercules. The game's wiki also makes reference to Hercules. And in fact, when the game was remastered in 2018, the developers went to great lengths to re-visualize him as more gladiator-esque and to reiterate he is a nameless hero. So where does this Hercules element come in? Well, it's because of that transmedia notion. What is it that defines Hercules? He is a figure of strength. He completes the unachievable tasks. He's on a quest for immortality. He fights against monsters. He's muscular. He occurs in ancient Greece or ancient Rome settings. All of these things are what help us to identify Hercules when he is present. The consequence is, though, should we get a game where the player has to do the identifying, we can then project these onto characters where it's not intended. Really helpful for us when we come to think about what is it that makes Hercules' character. Less helpful for the developers when that's not actually the intent that they wanted. But to move beyond that is to beyond the bounds of what we're doing today. And so I'm going to finish there with Hercules' journey through retro gaming history. And I'm happy to take questions on any particular games I've rushed over or anything else. Thanks for listening.
Well, Joel, you once again presentation. I do believe I have one person who's here is whereas it's just politely stated nearby. Do you see like an approach in your question? So I'll go and go for her.
Hello again, long-time listener, second-time caller. First of all, that was a great presentation. That was really interesting. I love retro games, and so I loved learning about it, especially since I love ancient Greek retro games. I did a question, sort of a two-part question, or more of a comment, because I know Julie was saying she doesn't like violent games. So I had a recommendation for everybody. If you don't like violent games, but you love casual, sort of fun games, there's a game series called The 12 Labors of Hercules, which can be found on the Nintendo Switch and Steam. Steam. And it's all about time management where Hades kidnaps Hercules' wife, and you have to clear all these roads in a limited amount of time. But the funniest part is Hercules doesn't do anything. He just lays in a hammock and lets all his workers do the work for him, and occasionally moves a boulder out of the way, and that's it. So I just want to give a shout out to that game, because I thought, you know what? A lot of games get very violent when it comes to Greek mythology, but that one might be fun. But I was curious to know your thoughts about, have you played any more contemporary games with Hercules? And what do you think of sort of the way he's portrayed in more modern games as opposed to sort of these retro games in terms of skills, but also in terms of story and character?
Great question. And thank you for the shout out to that game. There's actually a really interesting spin-off called Alexis Almighty, where you play as Hercules' daughter. Same sort of gameplay and everything. So yeah. So Hercules, this is actually part of a larger book project that sort of spans his whole history of video games. So I have done quite a bit in retro gaming, but also more contemporary games. One of the two sort of shifts in terms of Hercules' portrayal in more contemporary games is the first happens in sort of the mid-90s, where we get tie-in video games become a thing. And so Disney's Hercules becomes sort of the be-all and end-all. And he has his own franchise of action games and the like that are just telling the story of the movie or broadening the story of the movie, as well as sort of the Kingdom Hearts franchise, which interacts with Disney's larger world. And then he kind of falls into the back catalogue of Disney metaverse heroes. And so there's that. There's also Hercules and Xena Hercules does its tie-in thing. And then we try and even get some Hercules when the Avengers movies become a thing. Hercules becomes part of the back catalogue of the Avengers. So we sort of have this Hercules that is really just an expression of other media, but in a video game format. That's one sort of take that begins in the 90s and continues through to the present. Another take is, particularly in more recent years, we do get some Hercules, and this is more towards the violent end of the spectrum. Hercules as the boss, as the violent hero, violent antagonist that the hero has to defeat. I think God of War, everyone would be familiar with that particular franchise, and Hercules is a bad guy in that. But in God of War, no one is really a good guy anyway. So sort of everyone's a bad guy. He's still strong. He's arrogant with it. And so lots of the themes are the same. He talks about defeating Kratos as being one of his labors. So still that same sort of theme all comes through. But I find really interesting in Immortal Phoenix Rising and Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the Hades expansion pack, the DLC. Both of those games include Hercules as sort of a boss that has to be defeated, but he's been corrupted by an external chaotic force. And so by defeating him in battle, you sort of redeem him and he comes back to being sort of a good hero. I think that's a really interesting take because we like Hercules. He's sort of the best of the best. So how can we fight against him? It provides a really good challenge, but then we kind of want to redeem him as well. And so in Assassin's Creed, that is, you beat him, and then he agrees to help defend the Gate of Strength in the underworld, I think it's called. And so, but again, we still see those same things. He's associated with brawn, with muscles, even his move sets. He does things like earthquake, pounding the ground sort of moves. And so the themes themselves really don't change. It's the way that we find them expressed in exploration of genre and how we can fit into those genres. I think that changes. Yeah. And at that point, I could just start rambling. So I'll stop there. Those are the two main sort of significant differences is Hercules is a bad guy and sort of this high-end Hercules that actually belongs to other media, but we bring him to video games.
Perfect. Well, a comprehensive answer there. Not sure you could see if Megan was giving you some applause. We have another question coming up here from Colin 11 first.
Well, I think you're muted, Colin.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Joel. That was a great talk. My question for you has to do with how you approach the corpus of Hercules overall. I'm curious, like where you delineate Hercules from his like various local manifestations, whether that's like Melkart and like Phoenician setting. Do you incorporate that, like the kind of wide-ranging Herculean figures, more in your general research in general?
Yeah, my general research, I've tried to limit myself to figures who are called Hercules or Heracles, mainly because I plan all weight material. As it is, it's sort of like, what do you include? What don't you include? If that wasn't evident in the second generation where we just went bang, 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 yeah, there's just so much. In it, I mean, there's always been a problem when you come to talk about Hercules in media, thinking just about peplum. Like you have Hercules in some of the Italian versions of peplum movies. He's called Hercules. Sometimes he's called Samson. Sometimes it's Goliath. And then you get the English translation and they sort of cross all over. So yeah, basically I've tried to limit myself to instances where he is explicitly identified as Hercules or Heracles, just to make things easy on myself. But I do keep a sort of ear out for, or an eye out for wider Herculean-esque interactions. But it's sort of, it's just for fun.
Thank you.
Excellent. And are there any other questions we have for Joel? Let's see none. I want to thank Joel one more time for all the presentation out here. Herculean effort, you might say.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you, everyone.
And for all of those still here at History one of our 30 annual conference, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed your time. We also feedback. And we'll be welcoming you back tomorrow